Welcome to the seventh Resilience talk titled Leadership in Crisis. The first talk here is from Lieutenant Colonel Langley Sharp from the Center for Army Leadership, and the second talk from Mr. Dimitrios Spyridonidis from Warwick Business School. I hope you enjoy the talks.
What leaders are, their character, what leaders know, knowledge, and what leaders do, the action. And on the right-hand side there, you'll see the model, the Army leadership model that we use, which talks about how we do it, how a leader performs the action. And for the theorists amongst you, you'll recognize John Adair's three balls in the middle there, task, team, and individual. Professor John Adair was an academic at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, almost 60 years ago, and came up with this very simple and effective model that talks about the task that needs to be achieved, the team that achieves it, and the individuals, including the leader, that makes up that team. And what we've done is put a context box around that, because every leader needs to understand the context within which they operate, and particularly in crisis, which is defined or characterized by uncertainty, ambiguity, and a very dynamic context which consistently changes. So it's imperative on the leader to understand that context, to be able to communicate to his or her people, and to be able to adapt their leadership style and adapt their actions according to that context. And the art of leadership then sits with the three balls you see in the middle there. And that careful balance, that interplay between task, team, and individual. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a minute. And when I say a balance, it doesn't have to be an equitable balance all the time. So there'll be periods where one of those elements takes priority. And a very simple example, if I wanted people to assault an enemy position, that is the task, it takes priority, even though individuals' lives may be at risk. But what is important is that the debt is then repaid to either the individual or the team once the task is over. So it's a constant balance between those three elements, and that being the art of leadership. What we've done at the Centre for Army Leadership over the last few weeks, and actually working with the NHS England Improvement on some of their leadership work, is taken our doctrine and just try to refine what is it that matters most, particularly in crisis. And it's worth saying that our philosophy endures in both peace and war. It's one philosophy. But we've brought out here some of the key elements which we think matter most in crisis. And it's by no means a definitive list, and it's clearly open to discussion and experience. And I'll talk through some of those now. Firstly, the task. Purpose. Every leader needs to define the purpose. What needs to be achieved? This is the why. What it doesn't do is define the how. And from a military perspective, we leave that up to the team to do where possible. So we have a thing called mission command, which basically says the commander or the leader states his or her intent. What do they want to be achieved? And they set the parameters, they set the conditions to their team, and they give them the resources with which to achieve that task. They don't say how to achieve it, they just say what they want to achieve. And that empowers the team. We hear a lot about empowerment nowadays. It empowers the team to bring their skills, knowledge, experience, creativity, innovation to the task in hand. And that raises the standards of everyone and achieves the task. It also creates a tempo, which is critical in crisis. And moreover, a purpose binds people together, and particularly in crisis, when that cohesiveness can be put under test. If you've got a morally robust purpose that drives and coheres the team, you're going to be a lot stronger for it. Secondly, then plan. You're going to struggle to deliver in crisis if you don't have a plan. It doesn't have to be 100% solution. It can be 80%, as long as you're delivering against a plan. And use the talent and experience of your team. Plan collaboratively. Rarely in crisis is there not enough time to harness the opinions and the experience of the team around you. Communicate your plan, and I'll mention communication a few times. Communicate your plan. Otherwise, the best laid plans are gone to waste if your teams don't understand what's to be achieved. Also, you need to keep an eye on the long term as a leader. It's very easy in crisis to become fixed on the here and the now, the task in hand. And whilst that is right in certain circumstances and certain times, you must step back and have a look and understand how your immediate task fits into your medium and long-term vision. Otherwise, you have a danger of becoming fixed on the here and now in a reactive organisation, a reactive team. And the last thing on plan is be prepared to adapt. got saying in the army, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And then finally, make decisions and manage risk, a core function of every leader. In crisis, you'll be under pressure. Pressure of time, information, pressure of resources, psychological, physical pressures. And your judgment will inevitably be tested, will be impaired. Above all else, do the right thing. Stick to your values. Do what you know is right. Moreover, not only will you make a sound decision, but you'll be able to live with the consequences. So do what you know is right. And the other thing I'd say about making decisions is a balance of speed versus time. You'll be inundated with the requirement to make decisions as a leader. Do you have to make them all now? Can you prioritize? What are the consequences of delaying those decisions, or indeed not making a decision at all? And lastly, manage risk. And what I mean by risk is understanding cause and effect and the consequences thereof. This is not a gamble, it's a calculated risk. And you need to take risks. Risk aversion is a danger in itself. Now, whilst you need to be precautionary, particularly under crisis and under pressure, you don't want to become risk averse. You need to take risk in order to exploit opportunities. I'll give you a very quick example that hopefully sums up an element of that. And it's from Afghanistan in 2013. And there was a sizable operation in a Taliban location, several hundred people on the ground, Brits, Americans, and Afghans. And two of my soldiers were at the heart of this problem. And everything was going fine. And sure enough, a couple of hours into the operation, the plan didn't survive contact with the enemy. And two elements of the force, one in the valley, one on the hill. The one on the hill came under very intense and accurate enemy fire, to the point where they were pinned down, they couldn't do anything, they were ineffective. And moreover, they couldn't communicate with the rest of the force, the main force in the valley. It was a very precarious situation. And so these two individuals took it upon themselves to move around a hill and into the line of fire to try and see if they could resolve and help deal with the situation. And just a bit into context, one of them is a private soldier, the lowest rank in the British Army, and one of them is a lance corporal, who's the next one up. So they were two of the most junior individuals on the field of battle that day. And they moved around under fire, a very accurate fire. One of the US soldiers got shot. They dealt with that casualty. And then the lance corporal decided to run up and down the hill with a machine gun on his back. He did that twice. Not only did he do that in the height of the summer, extreme heat, with over 100 pounds on his back, under fire, to the point where the rounds are landed around his feet and pinging off the machine gun itself. But he managed to communicate effectively between the two forces. He could put himself in a position to get the radios working. And his actions, or their actions, turned the tide of that battle. And for that, he won the Victoria Cross, which is the highest award for valour in the British Army. And why do I tell you that story? And it's a pretty extreme example, but it sums up what I'm saying here in this task. He understood the commander's intent. He understood the plan and his part in the plan. The plan didn't survive contact with the enemy, but he took the initiative because he was empowered to do so. And he knew what was right at the time for him. He made the right decision. He got communications going where they failed. He took risk, calculated risk. And he made the decision when he had to, and he turned the tide of the battle. I won't have time to go through all of these, but let me just talk very quickly about the first two: communicate and encourage challenge. And I've already talked about communication. Communication transcends task, team, and individual. One of the key skills a leader must have. In crisis is defined by, I've already mentioned, that dynamic context. It's consistently changing. And therefore, to stay ahead of that, or at least a pace for that, you need information. And for information, you need to communicate. Information creates shared understanding, decision-making, prioritization, and allocation of resources. So you must communicate up, down, sideways. And if anything, you need to over-communicate more than you would normally. Secondly, on communication, tell the truth. Be honest with your people. Stick to hard facts. And don't shy away from hard facts. If you don't know, and if you've got knowledge gaps, then be honest about that. People inevitably try and fill knowledge gaps with rumor and speculation, which can be very dangerous. So stick to the facts and be honest with your people. And finally, on communication, communication's two ways. In a crisis, people tend to want to talk a lot, but they don't listen. And when I say listen, I mean actively listening to your people. Understand their ideas, their opinions, their fears, their concerns. Secondly, then, encourage challenge. And it's clearly a balance here. But to get the best out of your people, to really gel as a team and to deliver against a task, particularly under pressure, you need to allow your people to challenge you, constructively challenge you. And we call it intelligent disobedience. And there's two elements to this. One, if a decision, an order, a direction is given that is unethical, your people have the moral obligation to disobey that direction or order. And secondly, there may be a circumstance whereby the leader gives some direction with the information, the best information that he or she has available at the time. But the team, when they come to enact that, have more information that makes that untenable. And a really simple example, I may tell someone to go and assault an enemy position. The team that move around to do that realize that should they do that, they'd be going straight into a minefield. So they have more information than I when I made that decision, so they have a right to challenge my decision. But there does come a point in any crisis, it's normally sort of at the culmination of a task, where rapid, unquestioning action demands decisive direction. And people need to do as they're told. I'm sure it's the same. There's many people from the medical profession here. There's a time where the task takes priority, the patient's life needs to be solved, and people do as they're told and get on with it. But that needs to be the exception rather than the rule. Again, in the interest of time, I'll move on to my last slide. And this is about the individual. And this will not be new to many of you, and hopefully not. This is about looking after your people and indeed looking after yourself. And it's about knowing your people. You can't look after them unless you know your people, know how they work, know how their emotions work, know what's going on in their home life, and take the time as a leader to understand your people. And a very quick example about understanding how people work under crisis, under pressure, and people will react differently. Again, a very quick operational vignette, if I may. We just completed an operation. We were out in the desert. There was about 100 of us on the ground, again, Afghans and Brits. And we moved out into an open area, ready to line up to get onto the helicopters to go back to base. And inevitably, that was the time when we become vulnerable. And sure enough, we came under fire that day from an enemy position. And just as I was about to move out and join the team, I just surveyed very quickly the different reactions of the people in front of me. And there were three different reactions. There were some who were literally, I've got a phrase of digging in with your eyelids, and they couldn't get any lower to the ground if they tried. And there were others, the John Rambos. There was an Afghan sergeant who's a great guy, who stood up at the front of the pack with his rocket propelled grenade on, firing at the enemy, but he was standing up in full view. And I think a guy next to him unfortunately got shot, but he was fine. And then there was others, and it was mostly my junior leaders, who were moving around and being utterly professional, controlling the situation and dealing with the problem and supporting their people. So three very different reactions, all three very natural reactions. 30 minutes later, we were on the aircraft flying back. And to get there, we had to run about, we dealt with the situation, we had to run about half a mile through the desert in the midday heat, in the middle of summer. So we're talking 48, 49 degrees Celsius with 60, 70, 80 pounds on each other's backs. And we got on the helicopter. It was Ramadan, so our Afghan partners hadn't eaten or drunk since 2 in the morning. And I surveyed the people in the aircraft and the different reactions. Some were asleep instantly, others were laughing and joking, and others were looking pretty pensive. And so my point here is you just need to understand that different people will react differently in a crisis situation when under severe pressure, both at the time but also afterwards. And you need to understand that, and you need to appreciate that. And the way you interact with them and deal with them as a leader will be very different depending on their personalities. The last thing I'd say, sorry, just before that, look after yourself as well. And much of what I've just described there is about you as a leader as well. If you haven't slept well, eaten well, controlled your emotions, if you're not self-aware, then how are you expected to look after your people and lead well? So you've got to know yourself, really, really critical. Look after yourself. And finally, be a leader. The leader is the one that makes the decisions, that sets the vision, that owns the risk, that binds the team, that cares for their people, and most importantly, they inspire. And that's you. So lead by example. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Langley. That was a really very interesting talk. For many of us listening, I suspect we don't have the military background or experience that you have. And I just want to sort of draw on some transcendent lessons that maybe we can all bring back to our workplaces. So some of you may have gathered from previous talks that I was involved in helping set up the Nightingale Hospital. And this was a multi-professional action between the military, the healthcare organizations and commercial contractors. And I think those three areas that you mentioned, individuals, the task, the team, were apparent in that endeavor, where as individuals we had to look after ourselves. As a team, we had to define a clear purpose. And as a task, we all knew what it was, which was to create the biggest hospital in Europe, to meet a unprecedented potential demand. So for those of us who aren't from a military background, with going back to our organizations and leading, I think one of the most important lessons that I've drawn are not only to have that clear understanding of purpose, but to communicate it to your team. Because I think many of us know what we want to do, but maybe people around us are not always on board or aligned to that. And that's usually a case of defining a vision, communicating it, and then including everyone involved. And as part of including people to get people moving forward in the right direction, I think explaining and communicating why you wish to achieve it is very important as well. And certainly in a sort of, should we say, challenging contextual environment like we're in now, like you might be in a military warfare situation. And military metaphors are being used at the moment all the time in the healthcare setting, as you may be familiar with. Actually knowing where you want to go and how you want to achieve that and communicating that to your team, I think is powerful. And certainly when I go into hospital every day and look on the faces of the nurses and the healthcare professionals and the porters, we all know what we're doing at the moment. It's because we're all, the society as a whole are clapping us on Thursdays, and we all know what we just have to get through this in the best way possible. And I think there are various ways to communicate. It doesn't have to be clapping every Thursday night, but actually engendering that sense of sort of unified purpose and communicating that on a wide audience is powerful. So thank you for that. Is there anything you want any other lessons that you might want to pass on to non-military background people, Langley, from your talk that you think we can take back to our organisations?
Yeah, can you hear me? I just would like to pick up. I think I think it was a great summary there. The importance of that communicating purpose. Purpose is everything, and where you can, clearly the purpose needs to be shared, and where you can enable your team or your organisation to take part in the creation of that purpose, even better. It's one thing to have a purpose and communicate it to your people, but if they were part of the solution, if they were part of bringing that purpose together in the first place, then that in instantly brings shared ownership of it. It's really, really powerful. And I think I look across the nation now, and there feels like there's a sense of purpose there. And you use the Thursday night clap as a good example, but that is a way of drawing everyone together. I think it's really, really powerful. But I look at the NHS, and although people say, oh, the military is a very different environment, but I look at the NHS and I see so many synergies to the way we do things. I mean, the NHS has got a clear purpose, and particularly now, I mean, ultimately it's about saving lives, and that's really, really powerful. It's a people organisation. It's an organisation that is motivated in the service of others, not by the self. It's fascinating to watch, and credit to you all.
Well, thank you for that. So I think that was really interesting here, because it's the first sort of military talk we've had. And as many of us will know from just listening to the TV, there's so many military metaphors being used, on the front line, in the trenches. So it's really powerful to hear what it is actually like leading on the front line. And healthcare is very different, but there are some transcendent lessons there. And hopefully now we're going to pass over to Dimitrios, who is a professor of innovation and creativity and leadership at Warwick Business School, who's going to pass on his, lessons for leadership in a crisis situation. So Dimitrios, can I ask you to take over?
Hi guys, hello. I hope you're doing well. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Dimitrios Spyridonidis. I'm an associate professor of leadership and innovation at Warwick Business School. So basically, I think let me kind of delve into leadership theory here to try to make sense of the situation. But before I do that, let me kind of give you a minute to understand or to explain, for example, what is going here. And as you know, I think you already know that this is not business as usual anymore. This is business unusual, and mainly because this is a very, as you said, very serious crisis, maybe the biggest crisis since surprise, surprise, another theme from the army since since the World War II. So possibly the biggest crisis since then. We're dealing with a health crisis. We're dealing with an economic crisis that it's increasingly becoming apparent. And I might say as well that we're dealing with a humanitarian crisis, and it's difficult time for leaders. It's difficult for everybody. More importantly, for leaders who have to influence and develop and support others. And it's difficult for leaders because leaders need to think about immediate response to the crisis, but also which is what's happening today, but also think about recovery and build up a new society and a new system, a better system. So leaders need to think about today and tomorrow, and this is difficult and quite paradoxical. So I think leaders need to understand how they navigate between paradoxical tensions. And I think one of the key important paradoxical tension here when it comes to leading in crisis is the paradox between individualistic and distributed leadership. And I'm going to talk about that primarily, but let me go back and exemplify the point I tried to make about today and tomorrow. I think it doesn't matter whether leadership today in a healthcare system, government organization, you name it. It calls for leadership to deal with the realities of disrupted supply chains, for example, and cash flow constraints, which is what's happening today. But also they need to think about the longer goal of creating a better economy and a better society. So there are a few paradoxical tensions here, but I'll focus primarily around the individualistic versus the distributed type of leadership that a crisis like this might require. So as you know, leadership might be hard to define, but in terms of crisis or during crisis, it's easy to identify. Yeah. So as the pandemic has spread fear, disease, death, national leaders across the globe have been severely tested. And, so some have fallen short. I think, our prime minister is not doing very well, and without me becoming political. But there are other leaders who have risen to the moment, demonstrating empathy, showing courage, respect for science, decency, and thereby trying to kind of dulling the impact of the crisis on the people. And then if we try to think about traits of leadership at the individualistic level, I think the masterclass on how to respond belongs to Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Very clear messages, quite very compassionate as well. Angela Merkel, another prototypical example of leadership image during crisis. Very well informed. I think it helps that she's a scientist and she can understand and handle numbers. But also, it goes down to her character as well. How thoughtful she is, the ability to reassure, and so forth. So by no means, I think you need a visible, accountable leader during crisis. I think that goes without saying. And you need that leader to be accountable as well for addressing the crisis. But then, if you think about crisis in its context, and I'm talking about systems here and system level leadership, I think a complex issue such as a flu pandemic involve a very large number of agencies, all of whom encompass, discrete professional and organizational experts restrictions, but work towards the same goal and share the same values. I mean, as a point of reflection, ask yourself, with how many different agencies did you interact today in order to perform your work? And that will give you an understanding of how complex this might be. So you need to distribute leadership, and I think what we see in many governments around the globe, there are at least 3 or 4 reasons that you need to develop capacity for leaders in the system, but also distribute leadership. I think the first thing that most governments try to kind of work, obviously, is the immediate coordination of the crisis. So you need leadership for that, by all means. You also need leadership to get the healthcare crisis under control. You also need to think about, we can see how, governments, and the third thing that you need to think about is how do you support the economy. And then you need to think, as a leader, you need to think about how do you build for recovery. So this is what's happening in most, if not all, healthcare systems in the world today. Healthcare leaders try to kind of navigate the complexity across those 4 elements. So you could argue that the configuration of leadership in response to COVID-19 is one that should demonstrate both individualistic and distributed leadership, and this is where the paradox comes. But it also has a temporal dynamic where leadership on the ground being enacted by different actors over the phases of, let's say, coordination, immediate response, and recovery. Which I think, and I'm going to wrap up now, which also brings us to make us think, what's the relationship between leaders and followers, because you can't lead all the time. And if you are able, if you want to be a good leader, you also need to understand when and how to lead. And I'll give you a very simple example here. So I think it's obvious that political leadership today needs to follow the science and the facts. So leaders need to follow the experts. Think about policy implementation, for recovering or responding to the crisis. Not only frontline staff, to you guys, required to engage with a policy imperative, to comply with the crisis, but this is where contextual knowledge comes from to inform policy for the next stage. So identities between leaders and followers become quite hazy here. So we need to remember that. Obviously, yes, we are leaders and we are leading a number of different tasks, but sometimes we need to also follow the people that have the skills, the knowledge, the capability for the task required. And I think my last point, and I think very relevant to our previous speaker, is none of this is relevant if you're not able to lead yourself. And yes, obviously you need to understand yourself, you need to lead yourself, and obviously the personal physical dimension is important. You need to kind of stay resilient, your mental agility is challenged. But this crisis creates a critical reflection point that can initiate some kind of personal development, increase your self-awareness about who you are not, what do you value, what you don't value, where you would like to be in the future. How does the crisis challenge some of the assumptions that you use to inform who you are or how you make decisions during crisis about the self and others. So I think there is great potential for leadership development during crisis. And I'm going to leave it there, close with a positive note as opposed to anything else. So I hope this is something, this is what you expect for today. I hope it's, it's useful, and be safe. And then I think that's me. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Dimitrios. That was excellent. So what you mentioned was, of course, you need to have individual traits such as empathy. You've talked about the likes of Jacinda Ardern. You've talked about distributive leadership system. Good example is Germany, of course, and the fact that a leader has to be a follower, because the leader does not know everything. They have to take the lead from the experts. And my personal perspective is that's a very interchangeable thing, because the followers themselves have a leadership capacity because they're leading on with the leaders. So before we move on to questions, I would like to introduce next week's topic. So we have Colonel Jill Wilkinson with us. Could you just raise your hand, please, Jill? Fantastic. So Colonel Jill Wilkinson is the Deputy Commandant of the Royal Military Academy of Sandhurst, and she's going to be talking to us next week on how does one connect with their team? How does one enhance the cohesion and connectedness with the team? So on this note, we'll move straight to questions. We've had some really good questions coming from the chat box. We'll take the first question from Rajinder Nigam. So I will unmute you, Rajinder. You had a very relevant question, and I did like it. So why don't you ask the panelists?
Oh, which one was that?
That was the one at the very beginning. The one about the dilemma, the conflict between your values and taking an action that conflicts with your values.
Yeah, I think that was in relation to the decision that we are taking, whom to take to intensive care unit and whom not to, whom to refuse this, so to say. And then when we come to intensive care unit, whom to offer invasive ventilation, and then whom to refuse. I think we've been following some kind of a scoring system, but then each individual patient is different. And we feel very guilty about others whom we refuse. And sometimes we question whether this could be because of limited resources in given other circumstances. Would we be offering treatment to those patients in different circumstances whom we're refusing now? And this goes against our moral, so this is the moral dilemma and ethical dilemma that we are facing every day.
Yes, absolutely. It's a situation of moral distress where you have to conflict with your values. And Dimitrios or Langley, I mean, how do you, so what's the academic, if you like, frame, Dimitrios, on dealing with ethical dilemmas between how you exercise your values against the realities and use your reality and value judgments to actually make an action judgment? And I mean, and Langley, in a sort of military situation, you obviously come across people with different values, arising from their own backgrounds. And how does one sort of, bring a shared purpose into that when it comes to actually making a decision that may be in conflict with the values of the individuals concerned? So we'll start with Dimitrios first.
Well, I don't think you can answer this question in 5 minutes. I think it's quite philosophical and very context dependent. And what I mean by that is, I think for starters, ethics is very subjective. What is ethical for you might not be ethical for me, but that's not necessarily the point I try to make. The point I try to make is that under different circumstances, your moral reasoning might be very, very different. But because we are dealing with such because of the magnitude of the crisis, we need to think about the bigger picture here. And I think the bigger picture here is that we might need to make some tough decisions, to ration healthcare, scare resources for the benefit of the society rather than for the benefit of the individual. Whether that's right or wrong, that's very difficult to define. And this is how people, and this is something that can challenge decision making at a number of different levels. But look, it's a very similar situation with expensive, nice, guidelines and expensive cancer treatments. At the populational level, I think it's something that leadership can, accept, and support. At the individual level, it might be difficult. Can you see what I mean? It does depend on a number of different things how you approach this answer, but this question. But it's not an easy one. Yeah, it's a very difficult one.
Langley?
A difficult question, and without doubt, a very difficult circumstances for people to be in. There is no black and white answer. There is no right or wrong in these situations, and I think that's the first thing to recognise. People are going to die in some of the circumstances you describe, and the thing is, you just don't control all the levers to give a perfect solution, which means that everyone's going to come out of it healthy. So to a certain extent, you can only work with what you've got and the levers that you can facilitate, which is very, very tough. And I think it ultimately goes back to can you challenge up through to your superiors where you think things can change to affect the situation, to give you more freedom to save more people, which is probably difficult in these circumstances because resources are so tight. And ultimately, it's about continuing to communicate your team and having that shared understanding of the problem. And whilst you may be the one that makes the ultimate decision, it's also relying on your team to help share in that decision making as well. So you're all part of that. But it's really, really difficult. And as I say, the reality is you just don't own the levers, and there will come a point where, say, unfortunately, people may die in the circumstances you describe. In terms of the shared values piece, I'm not sure I answered that question. Have to come back on that one. The shared values piece, and again, that's really difficult, Ali, and that's why the British Army places so much of an emphasis on our values and also our standards as well, professionalism, lawfulness, and appropriate behaviour, because we do get people from all walks of life, all cultures, people from all around the world join the British Army, with very different upbringings, and that's why we try to cohere people through this centrally set and accepted set of values and standards, which I think as an organisation we're very fortunate to have. And again, we don't always get it right, absolutely not, because we're human at the end of the day. And it's interesting doing some work with the NHS in the last couple of weeks, and the first thing I asked is, what's the NHS's values and standards or values? And we've got different answers depending on who you spoke to, because of the sort of nature of the NHS and the certain sort of fragmentation of the organisation, the trust and what have you. So it'll be interesting to see people's perspective there, but it's very difficult and no black and white answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
So I think we have a question from Chi. I wondered if she could kindly just ask a question. Are you on?
Hello, Chi.
Oh, hello. With the presentation earlier, I kind of noticed that a lot of the countries that dealt with Corona tend to all have female leaders. And my question is it that females tend to do better with crises? And if that's the case, how do we go about making sure we have training positions and opportunities for women in leadership within the NHS and other organizations?
I think that's an easy answer for me. I think it's easier for women to show more compassionate type of leadership because of because it's more natural to them, and that's what makes it, I think, easier to kind of see this type of behavior for female leaders. I might be biased, but I think that's why it's so prevalent these days. I think that's how I think I would answer that. It's easier for female leaders to show more humane leadership styles as they relate to empathy, compassion, and so forth.
With regards to them making leadership positions more available to women, like how do organizations go about making sure that obviously the positions for men and females are equally balanced as such?
Again, another question that requires, quite a lot of time, because it goes back to, things that relate to culture, organizational culture, national culture. It's not something that, you see what I mean? It's a very kind of one of those grand challenges that require quite a kind of multidisciplinary thinking. So if you want to improve women in leadership, you need to think about the culture, where you're coming from, the national culture, the organizational culture, and then slowly these things will tell you whether and how you're going to do it. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it does. But obviously, when you talk about culture, I do understand, like, in the UK, we have people from different cultures, but still, we're not talking about like culture with regards to, like, say, a culture in Africa. I understand like the difficulties with that, but I'm talking about with regards to being in the UK as a whole, as a country. How will that, like, moving forward?
Well, I think it's moving forward. I think if you compare and contrast what's happening today with what was happening 20 years ago, there is movement there. There is progress. But obviously, as I said, this goes against the dominant national and organizational culture in the country. So I think things at that level change, but doesn't change very, very often. Obviously now, with the COVID, I think we can see how things have changed with COVID quite radically, yeah? I mean, to pick up the example of the new hospital, Nightingale Hospital in London, it happened over 9 days. I think before crisis, I don't think it would be able to happen over 9 years. So it might be that crisis like this can facilitate and, expedite change across different levels. So it remains to be seen. It's a good point. COVID crisis might make us think about more humanistic aspect of leadership in a different way, and that can trigger change in a number of different aspects, including national culture and organizational culture.
I'm curious to see what Langley has to say about that.
Yeah, sure. I was just about to come in. A lot of my experience, because I'm in the military, it's quite a male-dominated environment, has been male leaders, although clearly I've been led and led females as well. I wouldn't say there's necessarily a definitive difference between male and female. I think leadership is very personal. I've seen superb female leaders, and the first one that comes to mind is the Prime Minister of New Zealand. I think she's phenomenal, and she's a great example right at the top. But even across the army, I've seen some phenomenal female leaders. But I've seen others who haven't performed well. Equally, males just the same. I think it's very personal. I do think it's important to have that diversity in an organisation, and that's certainly probably a weakness that the British military currently has, is our lack of diversity in terms of our female serving people. And it's great. Colonel Jill's on and may well give a perspective of that today or next week. But and that's something we're trying to address. Diversity is absolutely critical, particularly in a crisis when you need that diversity of thought and experience, not just of colour, race, gender. It's about thought and experience.
Jill, will you be coming in?
Well, probably really to reiterate what some of the others have said. I think the reason that a more compassionate style of leadership and the female slant on leadership is drawing so much attention at the minute is because society has become much more compassionate over the last 20 years, I would suspect. We are looking for more compassion in everything than we would have done. If I could put a point in time, I'd probably say before the death of Princess Diana. That changed the nation's way of mourning, of looking at death. There was a sharp shift in culture then. And then maybe I'll just touch on what Langley mentioned about females in the army. we need more diversity of all sorts for leadership in all fields. I think that as a woman in the army, we do, or I sense that what you might see as a more female trait is less usual in the army. You know, it is a male organization, so my leadership style is probably chosen to be slightly more in favor of the culture of where I work. You know, when I'm a part-timer now, I'm a reservist now, so I also work in other fields, and I might choose a different golf club from my golf bag because of the people that I am serving as a leader. So the female leaders are what their countries want at the moment, or those that we are perceiving to do well. And, you know, other countries prefer dictatorships. So there we go.
Any other opinions on that? What I'd like is everybody else's opinion on that matter. Could you actually type into your chat boxes that if you were given charge of this country, if you were the dictator of this country, what legislation or provision would you enact to ensure greater diversity, whether it's gender or any other type? So it'll be interesting to hear from you in your chat boxes. In fact, I might leave the chat box open beyond this meeting. Now we have a question from Lily Tan. Could you please come on the mic?
Is this the one about defining purpose?
Yes, yes.
Soldiers is the same as NHS workers?
Yes.
Difficult for me to answer because I don't know enough about the NHS, but I think generally in terms of creating purpose, I just go back to my point. You know, purpose is it's the glue that binds a team together. It's a very powerful, and to say particularly if it's an emotional connection, it can be very powerful. I like Simon Sinek's reference to Martin Luther King. He didn't say, I have a plan. He said, I have a dream. It's that emotional connection that binds people together. And so I think the principle of having a purpose absolutely is the same for soldiers or medical professionals. The context is clearly very different, but I think we're all human at the end of the day, and we all have that same sense. In the same way that, you know, again, the nation has come together for this sense of purpose to get through this crisis together. And it's a feeling that the nation has that didn't exist before this crisis, and didn't exist, you know, until whatever crisis you choose to talk about before then. So I think it's I think the principle is very much the same, but the context is different.
Yeah, I thought that was a very good question, actually. And what I inferred from it was that when you're trying to communicate with a body of people, actually, is the way that you communicate with, shall we say, a group of highly trained professional soldiers different from, shall we say, potentially more empathetic, caring healthcare worker background individuals? And so I just wondered whether you've got any comments on that.
I mean, at the end of the day, we're all human, and broadly, if you boil it right down, we all have the same wants, needs. You know, Maslow's hierarchy. You know, we're all intrinsically the same people. We want to add value and be valued. So I think that the very basic fundamental skills of communication remain the same. But inevitably, again, culture. Colonel Jill was talking about there. The culture, the ethos, the history, the traditions of our organisation are very different to the NHS. And therefore that breeds a certain type of different person in that environment. So that's inevitable. We all are chameleons to a certain extent and adapt slightly to different environments we're in. So there are nuances to that communication, I guess, but I think the fundamentals are the same.
Right, thank you so much. I'm sure you will agree with me. This was a very thought-provoking session. But we just want to bring it to a close now. And we also just want to remind you that we're here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Next week, we have Colonel Jill speaking about connectedness, how to connect more with your team. So please join us. And once again, with regards to CPD, do put in the chat box your email address so that we can then send you the CPD certificates. So without further ado, I just want to thank you very much again to our speakers, to all of you who've decided to be here today. We do value and appreciate your time. and we will see you. And also Professor Dimitrios, sorry, I didn't mention you, but yes,
thank you guys, thank you.
We will see you next week at the same time. Good night.
I'll leave the chat box open. You can put your chats in. If anyone of you wants to, that'd be very helpful. Good night.
Thank you, Alex.
Well,
thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Langley and Dimitrios. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Langley. Safe, keep safe. Dimitrios, keep safe. Jill, see you next week. Everybody keep safe. Bye-bye.